At the height of the bubonic plague, many of the elite physicians disappeared, but the ones who emerged are what nightmares are made of. When the Black Death tore through cities, Europe didn't just lose millions of people. Families vanished, entire villages disappeared from maps. And when the plague arrived, many of the most educated physicians did exactly what their survival instincts told them to do. They ran. University-trained doctors left infected towns. Court physicians disappeared. Medical elites retreated to the countryside, waiting for the air to clear and the bodies to stop piling up. But in the streets, among the dying, a different kind of doctor appeared. They weren't university-trained scholars. They weren't royal physicians. They were surgeons, barbers, apothecaries, and desperate, often heroic men willing to take a job no one else wanted. They became known as the plague doctors. Plague doctors aren't a medieval myth. They're not just symbolic figures or Halloween costumes. They were real men, hired, paid, and legally contracted to walk directly into plague-infected homes, while everyone else ran the opposite direction. A job that all but guaranteed death. And to do this, they armored themselves in one of the most disturbing medical outfits ever created, and what they wore still haunts us today. By the 14th century, Europe was all too familiar with death, but nothing prepared it for the Black Death. The plague started in 1347, and it tore through Europe in waves. In some cities, half the population died in a matter of months. Bodies filled homes, streets, churches, and anywhere else they could pile them. Bells rang non-stop, until no one was left to ring them. The plague ripped through cities so fast, people didn't understand what was happening. Wherever the plague went, death soon followed. That's when cities began hiring plague doctors. They weren't hired to cure the disease. They were hired to manage it. Their job was to count the dead, to examine the sick, to enforce quarantines, and to act as a barrier between the living and what felt like the end of the world. If someone claimed to have any kind of medical knowledge and agreed to stay, they were hired. Cities were not picky. Their contracts usually included a nice salary, housing, and legal immunity. And that legal immunity mattered because plague doctors were blamed constantly. If a patient died, families accused them of malpractice. If an entire household died, they accused the doctor of spreading the disease. They could not win. Cities knew these men would be hated, so they protected them with legal paperwork, but that paperwork also bound them to some horrifying duties. They were required to examine patients, confirm plague diagnosis, order quarantines, supervise burials, record deaths, and in some cases, even perform autopsies. These guys became walking symbols of death. When a plague doctor arrived, people didn't feel hope. They felt confirmation. Today, we often see the plague doctor suit as a creepy costume, but it wasn't designed to scare people. It was a deliberate attempt at protection based on the best medical theories of the time. But the iconic beaked figure most people recognize didn't fully emerge until the major plague outbreaks of the 1600s. A French physician named Charles Delorme is often credited with designing what became the standard plague doctor outfit. Delorme believed disease spread through corrupted air, known as miasma, which, according to their belief, was poisonous air produced by rot, filth, and decay. So if the air itself was poisonous, then protection meant sealing the body from it. The plague doctor suit was intended to be full body armor, designed to keep the doctor alive, much like a modern-day hazmat suit. Plague doctors wore long overcoats that reached the ankles. They were made from leather or a heavy cloth that was coated in wax, fat, or oil. The goal was to make the surface impenetrable, to prevent contaminated air or fluids from touching the skin. And underneath, they wore multiple layers of clothing soaked in vinegar or other substances. They wore gloves, boots, and tightly fitted hats. Every inch of their body was covered and sealed. Nothing was accidental. No skin exposed, no air unfiltered. But the creepiest part of the outfit wasn't the suit itself. It was the mask. The most haunting feature of the outfit, hands down, is the beaked mask. But it's also the most misunderstood. The beak wasn't designed to scare people. That part just came naturally. It was designed to filter air, to save the doctor's life. It had a long, bird-like beak that curved outward from the face. Some of them reportedly extended more than a foot long, and it turned doctors into something we see in our nightmares. And the beak itself was packed with aromatic materials, things like dried flowers, herbs, spices, resins, mint, rose petals, clove, and myrrh, which is like a resin from the sap of certain trees. They packed the beak with anything they believed would purify air or overpower the bad smells. And the idea was simple. If disease traveled through bad smells, then filtering the smell meant filtering the disease. They were wrong, but it shows how desperate they really were. But the beak itself also created distance. It physically separated the doctor's face from the patient's body. It was like a medieval version of social distancing. Even without understanding bacteria or fleas, plague doctors learned one brutal lesson quickly. Distance mattered. But the mask gets even creepier. The eye holes of the plague doctor masks were often fitted with red-tinted glass. And this wasn't just to look cool. Red was believed to repel evil forces. At the time, many cultures feared the evil eye, a supernatural force thought to cause illness, misfortune, and death. During plague outbreaks, fear of supernatural forces were at their peak. It was the only explanation they had for a plague that felt more like a curse. To them, disease wasn't just biological, it was moral, spiritual, and cosmic. The red lenses served multiple purposes. They reduced glare, they concealed the doctor's eyes, and they were believed to protect the wearer from curses, spirits, and corrupt influences that might pass through sight itself. In a time when plague could wipe out entire families in days, they leaned heavily on spiritual explanations. To them, it was survival. Plague doctors rarely touched patients directly. Physical contact increased risk. Even without understanding bacteria or fleas, plague doctors learned through experience that being too close could kill. So they figured out another way to distance themselves from their patients. Enter the tickle stick. They carried a wooden cane or a rod that many historians call a tickle stick. This tool allowed them to lift clothing to examine swellings, to point at instructions, to push patients away, and to measure distance. In some cases, they were even used to restrain panicking victims. The cane wasn't used for cruelty, it was a boundary, because during the plague, touch usually meant death. So what did plague doctors actually do? Contrary to modern belief, plague doctors weren't just creepy costumes. They had real responsibilities. They didn't cure the plague, instead, they documented it. Plague doctors kept records of symptoms, deaths, and household infections. Cities relied on their notes to track outbreaks, and these records became some of the earliest forms of epidemiological data. They enforced quarantines by sealing families inside infected homes. They supervised burials, often in mass graves. They examined bodies to confirm causes of death, and of course, they also treated patients. And that's where things become truly dangerous. Plague doctors had almost no effective treatments. They followed medical theory rooted in Galen and humoral balance, which taught that disease was caused by an imbalance of the four humors, so the balance had to be restored. And like many early medical treatments, they bled patients. Bloodletting was a common medical practice. Patients were bled to drain poison from the body. They opened veins to release excess blood. They applied leeches. They used cupping to draw fluids to the surface. They purged patients with laxatives and enemas. They induced vomiting. They blistered skin with irritating substances. None of these methods stopped the plague, but doctors believed violent illness required violent treatment, so they continued. Plague doctors also prescribed bizarre remedies. Things like powdered emeralds, dried toads, mercury compounds, arsenic mixtures, ground animal organs. They burned aromatic fires in homes. They recommended smoking tobacco to cleanse the lungs. They advised carrying flowers to ward off death. And patients were told to avoid bathing, avoid cold air, and avoid emotions that were thought to disturb the humors. All of these things seem like nonsense to us, but these were their only medical tools at the time. It was their only defense. As the plague continued, plague doctors became feared figures. They weren't just associated with sickness, they became symbols of death, because their arrival meant it was already too late. When a plague doctor knocked on your door, that meant someone inside was dying, or would be soon. They marked the houses to warn others. They enforced isolation, and they removed bodies. To the public, they didn't just represent healing or hope, they represented death. And over time, that image stuck. Even centuries later, the silhouette of the beaked mask still makes us feel uneasy. To the brave men who volunteered as plague doctors, there was a huge psychological cost. These men were surrounded by death. They often entered homes filled with corpses, and they watched entire families collapse in days. Many turned to alcohol, some became detached, a few even wrote detailed accounts of suffering that still exists today. But they didn't describe heroism, they described exhaustion. Because there were no cures, no victories, only the hope for survival and a promise of death. So did any of the plague doctor's methods actually help? Not really, at least not intentionally. The plague was spread primarily from fleas carried by rats. Miasma theory was wrong. Herbs didn't filter bacteria, and waxed coats didn't stop infection. But some measures actually did help. Full body coverage reduced flea bites, gloves limited contact, distance reduced exposure, and isolation slowed the spread. So in a lot of ways, they were right, but for the wrong reasons. Fear and desperation drove them to experiment, and sometimes experimentation leads to meaningful change. By the late 1600s, plague outbreaks began to decline in much of Europe. Things like improved sanitation, changing rat populations, and better public health measures reduced transmission. The role of the plague doctor faded, but the image still remains. Today, the beaked mask appears in festivals, art, horror films, and folklore. It remains one of the most unsettling medical symbols in history because it represents something much deeper. In a moment when medicine stood at the edge of knowledge, plague doctors stared straight into death. They were real humans doing everything they could with what they had against something they didn't understand. And sometimes, that's the sickest history of all. This isn't legend. This is sick history.